Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson contained in the Johnson edition. We turn now to the little poem 174, At Last to Be Identified. Now, this is a poem that was given the title Resurgam in 1890, the Latin meaning I shall arise. And there is a very phoenix-like quality to this poem, and we've seen this already in a number of the poems that we've been studying of Emily Dickinson. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already had exposure to our set of introductory comments. I'm also hopeful that you've worked with the preceding 173 poems. We just finished with poem 173, A Fuzzy Fellow. Now, it's fascinating to me the way that Emily's poems can be interpreted so differently. So this poem, I'm going to be drawing from two different scholars, both Ruth Miller as well as Judith Farr, as they both are commenting on the power of this poem. The first thing we want to point out is that this poem was written on the same sheet of paper as poem 172. Just to remind, poem 172, we've already given lecture on it, but just to remind it, 'tis so much joy, if I should fail, what poverty, and yet as poor as I, have ventured all upon a throw, have gained, yes, hesitated so, this side the victory. Life is but life, and death but death, bliss is but bliss, and breath but breath, and if indeed I fail, at least to know the worst is sweet. Defeat means nothing but defeat, no drearier can befall. And if I gain, O gun at sea, O bells that in the steeples be, at first repeat it slow, for heaven is a different thing, conjectured and waked sudden in, and might extinguish me. Now, that same poem on the same page had this poem, which I find fascinating in itself. Ruth Miller is going to argue that, as in the last stanza of the earlier poem, this is a cry of triumph as she imagines her poetry verse accepted and recognized. That is to say, to be recognized as a poet. Judith Farr will look at this poem rather from the perspective of the notion of a risen soul as it comes to reach the quote-unquote day of eternal life. And obviously with Resurgam as being the title that was given initially in 1890 when this poem was published, certainly, no question, you can read it either way. I'm going to leave it up to you. Let's enjoy the poem. At last, to be identified, at last, the lamps upon thy side, the rest of life to see, past midnight, past the morning star, past sunrise, ah, what leagues there were between our feet and day. Now, this phrasing of at last, you'll remember it in poem 4 when we went to work with that one. Do you remember this? In the peaceful west, many the sails at rest, the anchors fast, thither I pilot thee, land ho eternity ashore at last. You'll also remember it in poem 132. If happily any say to me, unto the little unto me, when I at last awake. 16 more poems shall use this phrasing of at last. I'm interested in 1505. When we get there, we'll remind ourselves we were there. She could not live upon the past, the present did not know her. And so she sought this sweet at last, and nature gently owned her, the mother that has not a knell for either Duke or Robin. At last. In other words, at the end, finally, we would say it, of course, finally, to be identified. Now, we will, in poem 754, play the game of this idea of being identified, one of the most famous of Emily's poems. My life had stood a loaded gun in corners till a day the owner passed, identified and carried me away. Of course, again, you can read this differently in different ways. The identification, can it be her poetry? Can it be her soul once it's identified in the afterlife? At last, it's a second line. The lamps upon thy side, the rest of life to see. Again, as we said in our introductory set of comments, everything about Emily, from her study, of course, of Plato and especially Republic, would be about perspicacity, insight, understanding, to be able to truly see. Go back to our study of Plato's Republic 7 and the cave allegory, to be reminded of what that means to come out of the darkness of the cave into the light of the sun, and what is it? You finally see, you finally understand in truth, in reality. And then we've got three pasts. That is to say, whatever identification she's referencing here, whatever achievement is she's talking about, you got to go past midnight, past the morning star. You'll remember poem 157 with morning stars and new life as it was played within that poem. Past sunrise. And then our use of the word we've seen this already a couple of times. It's a very American use of that. It's like a pause, right? What leagues there were between our feet and day. That by the way, serves as a dash would serve. Notice no dashes in this poem. What leagues there were between our feet and day. And this poem inevitably leads us back to the Odyssey and the idea of travel and the leagues between our feet and day. That is to say, finally we're going to make it. When we get to poem 1072, it will play like this notion of the day and the light. Title divine is mine, the wife without the sign, acute degree conferred on me, Empress of Calvary, royal all but the crown, betrothed without the swoon. God sends us women. When you hold garnet to garnet, gold to gold, born, brindled, shrouded in a day, try victory. My husband, women say, stroking the melody. Is this the way? We'll come back to a poem like this in terms of the recognition of achievement, whatever it is. I think at 2A, the message here is it takes so long to finally be identified, to finally reach the goal, right? To reach Ithaca, to speak in Odyssean language. But it feels so good to obviously do it at last, if you will. At 2B, I love how the poem, again, can be read from two different perspectives, Miller and Farr's interpretations. At 3A, well, obviously, we mentioned Plato's Republic 7. I think a lot of the cave allegory stands behind a poem like this, and obviously the Odyssey, as well as the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid. We've given full lectures on those poems at learnstrong.net. Finally, at last, a time to own this poem at 3B. What was a time in your life at last that you gained understanding, that you gained identification? And I'm hopeful that that's happening more and more with your study of Emily's poetry. Thank you.